All right, well, look, good afternoon, everybody. I think we will start as you have 1 hour to redesign the world. So every minute counts. Let me just welcome you all. You all know that the theme of the forum this year is this rethink, redesign, rebuild. Well, you know, at the center of that is the idea of this afternoon's session. Just why is it that we have, so many of us feel we have such a crisis of national decision-making structures just no longer fit for the job, fit for purpose? Why is it that so many of us are talking about the need for strengthened global cooperation arrangements, for renewing or rebooting the United Nations and the international financial institutions, in some cases even perhaps adding new ones or replacing some? What has brought about this mood of fundamental questioning about, is our international system, which was primarily, of course, designed in 1945, why are we so sure it's not up to the job anymore? And to introduce, to lead this discussion, we've got a fascinating panel because right beside me we have George Yeo, a foreign minister of Singapore, a country which doesn't get much more global than that, and yet is a small country which must rely on international rule of law and international frameworks if it is to achieve its objectives as a global trading nation. Next to him is Michael Froman. Mike is someone who's served in all the recent democratic administrations and is now the G8, G20 Sherpa to his own old law school classmate, Barack Obama, and therefore has had a huge hand in the way the G20 has come to such prominence over the last year. Beside him is, I think he'll forgive me if I say this, the new boy on the block, the very recently appointed Prime Minister of Jordan, Samir al-Rifai. And Samir, you know, already inherits, as Prime Minister of Jordan, a whole host of problems, which I think he'll tell us can't just be solved through national action. Beside him is Indra, Nooyi, known to many of us for the extraordinary role she plays as a board member of this forum, but also known to us as an extraordinary business leader at PepsiCo, who, whether it is dealing with issues of nutrition for the poor, is pushing the concept of what the modern global company is doing. But are the global cooperative structures and the national ones helping or hindering her in that effort to build a new kind of global company? And beside her, Prince Haakon of Norway, who is not here to talk in that role, but is here to talk as the convener of our young global leaders here at the forum, a group who have a huge ethic and interest in public service, both global and national. And what do they think about the state of our international institutions? I'm going to start at this end. George, I've, in a sense, set up the question. Singapore is a country which needs a stable, peaceful neighborhood and world to achieve the extraordinary economic competitive advantages or the rewards of that to enjoy them to the full. Do you think the global system is working effectively from your point of view?
Well, we are entering a new phase in human history with the collapse of the Berlin Wall 20 years ago. The old hierarchies have broken down, and this intermediation which we talked about in the financial industry, it is happening in all fields of human endeavor, in the family, in the corporation, in churches, in mosques, in schools, the relationship between parents and children, teachers and students. And indeed, governments as monopolies are being disintermediated. And big power relationships, the Cold War, when you had two big poles in the world, all that has given way to a messier, web-like structure. And Singapore has always prospered by being a node in a web. If you watch the port, the airport, the business community, we survive by synaptic connections, not a static web, but accepting that the web is changing all the time, the connections are changing all the time, but somehow reinventing ourselves and maintaining that position. I think it is accelerating this new phase of globalization because it's opened to us opportunities which we did not have in an earlier phase, the growth of China, of India, or the reestablishment of our links to our ancestral homelands. But it's also created new dangers because when the old channels are disintermediated, the old checkpoints are no longer effective. So whether it's terrorists, whether it is mischievous ideas, whether it is pandemics, there are also new dangers and therefore a need to create new immune systems. But I think on the whole, provided the state of the world is in reasonably good repair, it can be messy, and in the messiness there are opportunities. We're quite happy that the world is entering a new phase because it's given us plentiful new freedoms which we did not have in the last phase.
Thanks, George. Mike, I mean, for the years since 1945, the United States has played more than its fair share in underpinning global stability and cooperation, often in ways which have ended up being highly controversial. Some like it, some hate it. But one's got the impression that under President Obama, there is a rethink, a recognition that with the rise of Asia and other regions, the US needs to look again at these international institutions so that there is a better sharing and better participation in both the military and political effort, but also financial effort of keeping the world peaceful and prosperous. So where is the US going in terms of its vision of international cooperation?
Well, first of all, I agree with what George said about the increased interconnections, and for both positive and with both positive and negative outcomes. Global transportation has allowed people and goods to flow, but it's also spread pandemics. The internet's a wonderful global library, but it's also an organizing tool for terrorists. And the financial markets, which have been critical to accelerating the flow of capital and foreign investment and aiding development, have also shown that where a crisis arises in one place, it can spread both to other markets and to the real economy. And so that's, I think, by way of background, I think one piece of it. The second piece, as you said, is that it's not just state actors anymore. It's NGOs, it's corporations, it's individuals, it's non-state actors. And I think, and maybe this is counter to your theme of the panel, but I think in some ways this underscores the role of the state even more so, because the state has to figure out both how to deal with and coordinate and manage the multiplicity of actors around the world and find new ways of dealing multilaterally with each other to solve the global problems. The G20, as you cited, was one example. Moving from the G7 or 8 to the G20 was a recognition that you couldn't solve global financial problems with 7 or 8 alone. You needed the major economies at the table. And now looking ahead, whether it's the framework where the countries are submitting their domestic policies, their structural reforms to peer review, or their financial regulatory efforts, where we'll try and set global standards through the G20 or the Financial Stability Board, and then implement them domestically. There's an important role for the state, both to help coordinate internationally, but also to implement domestically. The same could be said about climate change. The Major Economies Forum, the 28 countries that met in Copenhagen and helped form the Copenhagen Accord and then brought it to the UN. We need to find new ways of dealing with each other multilaterally. We're a strong believer in multilateralism, broadly defined and pragmatically applied. And that means taking the institutions that exist and strengthening them, giving them greater efficiency, broadening their participation, giving them greater legitimacy, but also finding ways to create new fora or new mechanisms for dealing with it. I think we see that in the financial area, climate change, and even development policy, where on food security, we're beginning to coordinate donor activities really for the first time in a significant way. Having said that, I think there are a number of open issues, and I'll throw it back to the moderator. One is it's easy for states to come together when there's a crisis. Will states continue to work closely together and take concerted action when the crisis recedes? Secondly, now that more countries have a seat at the table, are they willing to pick up a piece of the check? They want a greater role in international governance, but are they willing to take on greater responsibilities as well? Thirdly, I think we're taking steps towards modernizing institutions, but we need to modernize mindsets as well. As we saw in many of the ongoing negotiations, including climate change, you still have states operating in blocks that were defined by the Cold War, not by the reality that every state needs to work together to deal with a collective action problem. And finally, and here I underscore the pragmatically applied multilateralism, I think the 80-20 rule very much applies to this. If you have the key states, the critical mass of participants willing to take action, is the international system going to allow a small number of states to obstruct progress? And I think those are all challenges that the states face ahead.
Well, Mike, thanks. We'll come back to a lot of those points, I'm sure. Samir, you live in a difficult neighborhood, but so many of your resources, your trade, depends at the very least on your region, if not more broadly. I think half the water supply of the Middle East is not inside countries, but shared across borders, for example. Have you already come to a conclusion that it's hard to be just Prime Minister of Jordan? You need also to kind of find ways to engage with the international system, that the solutions to some of those problems lie as much abroad as they do at home?
Thank you. Just going back to your initial comment about being the new boy here, I couldn't agree with you more. 6 months ago, I was at the Harvard Business School doing a course on turnaround strategies for my private equity fund. Little did I know that I'd be doing it on a larger scale. And in the last month, when we've sat as a cabinet and discussed what His Majesty's vision is for not only for Jordan but for the region, it's obvious that no longer can we function or think as individual states. The decision is not individual anymore. If it's water, if it's energy, if it's food security, these are all issues that have to be discussed on a regional level. And thus, there's so much importance on regional cooperation and on peace. If we take, for example, the water issue, Jordan's the fourth most arid country per capita in the world. We don't have any water resources, nor do we have the financial ability to desalinate. So what we're looking at today is how do we create a system where we have a regional desalination project that will service Jordan, perhaps part of Saudi Arabia, perhaps part of Iraq on the Jordanian border, and Israel. These are all projects and connected with a railway that will connect Europe to the Gulf, and then connect gas pipelines from Egypt going to Europe and from Iraq going up to Syria and down to Egypt as well. One can't look at projects as individual projects anymore, and one can't look at states and look at what they have individually and say we're going to create a regional project. So regional cooperation is extremely important. The discussion in the past about Turkey creating a peace pipeline where some of the water supplies from Turkey would run through Syria and then down to Israel, part of it would go to Saudi Arabia through Jordan, is something that unfortunately has not happened because peace has eluded the region for quite some time. However, Jordan has started to move forward with the Red Dead Canal, which is a canal linking the Red Sea to the Dead Sea, which not only for environmental aspect is extremely important because the Dead Sea is losing 1 meter of water a year, and we will not have the Dead Sea in 60, 70 years. This will also create energy because of the pumping up and then down to 400 meters below sea level, and will also desalinate. This will be important for Jordan, but Jordan cannot finance this alone, so it has to be a regional project where other key players do the same with the gas. So what I'm basically trying to say is that each country individually has significant problems and significant challenges, and individually these challenges cannot be solved. And thus we need to look at how we solve them regionally, how we solve them with the international support, because if we don't in the future create the food, energy and water security for countries will start, whether we like to admit it or not, looking outside of their borders for that. And that would be even more of a disaster.
Well, thank you. I mean, I don't think you could get a better description of the entanglement of all of these issues, security, energy, resources, infrastructure, in a way that evidently cannot be managed anymore at just the national level. Indra, you run and are building an extraordinary global company. Do nation states get in the way? I'm sure you'll quickly say they're vital, and I don't think anybody's disputing that point, but are there things which you'd just much prefer to see handled and regulated and managed at a more global level? And are the global arrangements which might allow that anywhere near in sight?
So let me speak from the perspective of large global companies. I think large multinationals, global companies, are critical to drive job creation, spur innovation, transfer technology. They're actually very essential for lifting many countries out of an emerging market or developing market or developed market status, and really are the backbone for a lot of job creation. Today, many multinational companies are bigger than little countries, and they're really a force to be reckoned with in the world. And I think in most cases, multinationals today operate under very difficult conditions because there are no global bodies that coordinate the principles and rules under which global companies should be operating, whether it be food safety, quality, flow of products, emissions, taxation, labeling standards, marketing standards, building standards, engineering standards. There are no global laws that help these global companies operate. So when that doesn't exist, companies typically fall back on local standards, because you want to stay competitive with local companies. But when there's an issue, if there's an activist NGO or an activist government, they turn to the global company and refer back to the highest standard that the company operates under and says, why can't you have those standards in this country? And that starts a vicious circle of which standard you operate under. It's not a very good situation. So what's needed? I think the first thing is we have to accept that big multinational companies are good for many economies, in fact, every economy in the world. They're good for countries, they create jobs, they spur innovation, they transfer technology that are so vital to improving the standards of living. You talked about the water problem, Samir. Big companies like ours can help in agronomy, can help bring best practices from around the world to your countries to help solve the problems. But for global businesses to continue to operate and do what they do best, we need some sort of a global coordination or national standards that are very clear, which serve as business operating principles, but standards that are clear and then don't go back and forth and are altered based on the situation at hand. And the only way you can develop these standards if we have an oversight and an enforcement body that serves as the watchdog, someone that updates the rules, educates the companies and the nations on how to enforce them and live by them. Now, it's very important that nation states cooperate to create these global bodies because they don't exist in many cases. And once you create these bodies, you've got to participate in keeping them refreshed and then abide by whatever comes out of these bodies. Now, this is hard. Nobody's saying this is easy because a lot of the nation states don't have common shared interests. They don't have similar legal standards. They don't have the same religious standards. We have to be cognizant of all of that. But if we want global business to be a force for job creation, a force for transfer of technology, it's critically important that we start creating these bodies to remove these barriers that stand in the way of economic development.
Thank you very much. Haakon, you, as I introduced you, you've got your finger on the pulse of your fellow young leaders here, and they have been busy working here and before Davos on all sorts of proposals for strengthening international cooperation. So, are they ready to throw themselves into this? How do they see these institutions changing? And to what extent are they frustrated and feel that these institutions don't kind of understand the needs and demands of the next generation?
Thank you, Mark. First, just let me say that I'm very happy and privileged to be on a panel with such admirable leaders as yourselves. I think what I'm doing is I'm chairing the steering group on the Young Global Leaders Global Redesign Initiative Task Force. That's a mouthful. Now, so what we're doing is basically, I think there's two words or two things I think that characterize what we're doing. One is that the Young Global Leaders are focused on involvement. Now, involvement of youth and letting the voice of the youth be heard, involvement of both genders, involvement of the poor, involvement of all regions of the world. So involvement and letting people's voices be heard is really core to solving this world's biggest challenges. I would actually go as far as to say that if we are not able to involve more voices and to involve more people in becoming problem solvers and innovators, we will not be able to rise to the challenge and solve all the problems that the world is facing. Now, so involvement is an important issue. The other thing is that the YGLs are hand-on and focused on doing something, action-oriented. So we don't actually like to look at the system and use a lot of time on whining and complaining. We want to see possibilities and move forward, find ways of actually solving the problems we are seeing. So right now I think we have around 30 initiatives, and they range from very sort of bottom-up initiatives such as Young Voices from the Youth Task Force. This is a report that the Youth Task Force made. In 20 countries, they had city hall meetings with young people, and they asked them what is needed in the world. And through this report and through the presentations that Jennifer Carrero and Nancy Lubin is doing here at the World Economic Forum and other places, these voices are heard. So that's one example. We also have other examples, such as within health, Deworm the World is something that has been going on for a few years already. Last year, they reached 10 million kids. Now, if you have parasitic worms, that means that you will probably not get the nutrition you need. And it's really cheap and easy to give drugs to young people that will actually solve that problem. And they reached 12 million kids last year. Next year, or this year, they're hoping to reach 20. So that's something that's already up and working. We have new ideas also, such as global responsibility license, which is on intellectual property. James Moody of Australia is doing that. And it's basically about how we can create a system which gives the poor access to intellectual property, so that it is cheap or free and readily available to them. So that could really be a big thing. So there's many things I could mention here, but if you're interested, I have some materials, and you can come over afterwards, and I will give you some materials about that. But I think that involvement and hands-on doing something is what the Young Global Leaders are about.
Well, Haakon, I mean, I think it is a really interesting point that, I think many of my generation, we spent years trying to kind of renew these institutions through legislative international action. They are much more about sort of just jumping in and making things work through individual initiative, using the structures that are there and injecting just volunteerism, organization, their contribution in ways which, despite the weaknesses of the existing organizations, just get on and produces these results. And I think, that's a fantastic to see that. But let me, just before opening it to the floor, ask all of the panelists just one sort of simple question, and it comes from what Mike said about can we only get international reform when there's a crisis? And he and I both having been involved in the G20 and seeing more reform in a few short months than frankly we'd seen in decades, it is easy to draw that conclusion. But, you know, there are other crises, they may not be so obvious, but whether it is drinking water or poverty or migration, you know, they are pushing people's states, structures to the limits and, you know, demand action sooner rather than later. And so I'm just going to ask each of you almost a kind of a yes or a no plus a sentence of illumination. Do you think it's realistic to think we could have ambitious reform of the international organizations over, say, the next 3 to 5 years? George?
I think we should be specific. What we need to do is to bring emerging powers like China and India into the power equation. So the G8 cannot do this, so it's got to be enlarged. You can't enlarge by just 1 or 2, so it's become 20. And that has to become the agent of change for the reform of global institutions. The key here is to strengthen existing global institutions, not to weaken them. Because if the G20 seeks to weaken or bypass existing institutions, there will be a revolt by the other countries. So using the G20 to instigate change in existing institutions is critical, because if we don't succeed in doing this, the crisis that will come in the future will be even bigger than the one which created the G20 in the first place.
Thanks. Mike?
Yes, I think we can reform and strengthen international institutions, and I suppose maybe it's a non-answer to your question, but in part because there are always crises. I think Haiti will force us, for example, to find ways to work together as a donor community, both not just the traditional donors of the G8, but Brazil, China, India, many other countries who are active there, to be more effective in rebuilding Haiti. And I think whether it's the water crisis or other crises, we will have to work within structures and invent new structures around the idea of effectiveness. Again, I would just underscore pragmatism. If the existing institutions can work and be made to work, terrific. If they can't, we shouldn't wait while serious issues are being undealt with.
Samir?
I totally agree. I think it's essential. It's not optional whether we should do it or not. As you mentioned, the world is going into all sorts of challenges. There are going to be crises. The important thing is to actually say these are the existing institutions, and this is what they're supposed to be doing, and this is how we can make them work. And if they're not enough, then let's create new ones and give them a clear mandate of what are they supposed to be doing and how are they going to do it, and back them up in terms of the political and the financial resources.
Indra?
I agree with what's been said so far. I think we have no choice. We have to reform, we have to strengthen, but we have to create institutions where they don't exist today. But the most important thing is we have to prevent the next crisis. Because if we keep talking and we don't do what's needed to avert the next crisis, we're going to be in a Davos 10 years from now and say, remember that panel in 2010? I wish we had created those organizations. I don't want to be on that panel.
Now with, I think, new areas that we now think of as global commons, but maybe we didn't 10, 20 years ago. The atmosphere, for instance, is not something that was really thought of as an important global common to address, and now with climate change, it's very much on the agenda. So I think it's important that we keep our eye on the ball. Poverty, climate change, equitable globalization, how do we do that in the best positive way? So the answers of how we reform will also have to be linked to what we're trying to achieve.
Great, thanks. Now let's open it up and we'll take a few questions. And if you can, yes, gentlemen at the back, just identify yourself if you would, and microphone to the back there. Wrong way.
I'm Musa. I'm a global change maker from Iraq. I'm 17 years old. And I was wondering, with large corporations and individuals, how are you contributing to youth involvement? And how could youth hold you accountable to that? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a few more. We'll hold some in the front row here. We bring, not front row, but we've got a clutch here.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Børge Brende with the Red Cross. I just came back from 1 week in Haiti, where we were deploying different field hospitals. And of course, it was frustrating to see that it took 1 week to double the capacity at the airport so the humanitarian relief could have access. And which kind of body in the UN has the authority to then just get in the first day and say that we're running this airport and we get all the humanitarian relief in there? Secondly, I think the bodies that were created, Bretton Woods, NATO, etc., was created after the Second World War. But no, a lot of the issues that we are facing are issues inside countries, not between countries. Sudan, North and South, Somalia, almost a failed nation states, Yemen, it's inside, Afghanistan, it's Pashtun, it's also internal conflicts, the same in Pakistan. What kind of institutions can we create so that also can address the new issues that we are facing? I think this is an important part of the global redesign initiative.
Great. Yes.
My name is H.R.H. I'm from PricewaterhouseCoopers and one of the young global leaders. My question is about networks, and both Minister Yu and Prime Minister Rifai mentioned that regionally they have issues that can only be solved by working with regional countries. Now, if we leave the large, sweeping, supranational organizations like the UN who are dealing with climate change, and we go back to the regions, how are they going to work out these governance networks? What's the mechanism for these regions to come together? Are we going to see more regional institutions, smaller ASEANs, and people coming together in a larger group of nations, like every 5-10 countries who share some of these issues, from security to water issues? So are we going to see more of the proliferation of networks, regional networks, some of them probably ad hoc? And if not, how are we going to be on the table discussing this with countries around us? Because just getting them around the table is going to take a couple of years, and I think we're running out of time on some of these issues.
Any more in this first round before we come back to our... Yes, up in the front here, please. Annie.
Annie Sparrow, I work for UNICEF Somalia. It's really an echo of the Red Cross question, but about that interface of international institutions and sovereignty. I work on Somalia, which we all know is possibly the worst failed state ever. I live in Kenya, interestingly enough, PricewaterhouseCoopers has described the government of Kenya as being very easy to work with, very low corruption index, fully transparent. And yet Transparency International describes Kenya as the most corrupt country in East Africa, and I would fully endorse that after living there for 4 years. So it's that practical interface of I come back to sovereignty and international institutions, and how you think you can actually use those practically to leverage those national problems.
Okay, now I'm going to sort of I think rather than having everybody answer each question, what I'm going to do is, and any one of you can jump in if you want to add a comment, but I'm going to try and direct them a bit. And Haakon, if you wouldn't mind picking up the first question from our Iraqi friend at the back about youth.
Okay, but I think he was asking what the corporations are doing. Wasn't that right? And I wouldn't be the right person to...
You're right. Then Indra, maybe you could... I tried, Indra.
I already told you a little bit about how we try to incorporate.
Yeah, that's fine.
I mean, the lifeblood of all business is the young people. I mean, they come in with fresh ideas. They challenge status quo. They shake up everything in the company. And I think a company that doesn't constantly renew itself by hiring young people is a company that's deemed for extinction. So in our own company, every year we're on campuses. We are in business schools, undergraduate colleges, and we bring in a fresh crop all the time. And we accelerate some people so they can even challenge senior management. Others, we allow them to take on a regular path. Thank God for the youth. They're irreverent. They operate by different rules, but by Jove, they keep us on our toes and make sure that we remain a company that's building itself for you, the youth. And I think that responsibility is forever in our minds.
Okay, let me take the sort of the two questions which dealt with weak states. And there are a couple of points here. One, a very practical one, why doesn't the UN seize command on the first day of an airport and direct flights? Mike, in a moment I'm going to ask you, because actually the US took control of the airport, which frankly, having watched what happened at the tsunami and having watched US control of the airport there was an extremely effective thing, but it does seem to have had some controversy in the case of Haiti. But I'm going to ask you to address that. But I think there's a broader point, which is, how do we intervene in weak states, and how do we call a spade when there are issues of corruption? And George, you were very, very involved in the response to Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar. You had to kind of organize an ASEAN effort to get international assistance in at a time that the government there was very reluctant to let it happen. So you might want to pick up this issue of how do we build the laws and norms that allow what is often called the responsibility to protect, but in many ways is broader than that. How do we intervene when there's a crisis and a people's own government are not properly addressing it? And then, Samir, if you would pick up this point about the regions that was made here. But as I say, if we could just start first, Mike, just on this Haiti point and anything else that you might want to say on that.
Well, first, I think we have to start with the recognition that the tragedy in Haiti is of mammoth proportion, and one will always want things to work faster, better, more effectively than they do. Having said that, I think it's important to recognize how well, in many respects, the effort has gone. The fact that the airport was rebuilt and opened as quickly as it was, that the ports were rebuilt, that you now have a capacity for distribution of containers in the amounts that you do, that more people have been saved from the rubble than any other operation in history, that medical care, both onshore and offshore, has been provided. And this is due not to the U.S. I think this is due to the fact that the UN, the U.S., the major donors from Latin America and major countries involved from Latin America, the Canadians, the French, and others, the Chinese sending rescue workers, the Indians sending resources, that it has been a truly global effort that has been organized on the fly, but really quite effectively. By no means perfect. I hope we'll all draw lessons from this and build on it. But the fact that there's already been one donors conference within the first 2 weeks in Montreal, that there's already plans for another major donors conference within a couple of months, and that I think that the work out between not just the U.S. military and civilian efforts, but other forces that are involved there and the UN has been working fairly well and improving day by day. This is an effort, I think, as George alluded to, where it's important for us to build up international institutions. We want the UN to be successful in Haiti. We want MINUSTA to be successful in Haiti. And at the same time, we want to make sure we get to people and get them supplies and medical care as quickly as possible in an unbureaucratic way as possible. So I'm hopeful that in retrospect, when history looks at this incident, they'll say this actually was a pretty good response on a global level, both working through the UN and with other parties.
George.
I must say I am very touched by Mike's humility in the way you presented the Herculean efforts the U.S. made in leading the rescue effort in Haiti. Yesterday, while waiting for the car, I bumped into President Clinton and asked him about Haiti and the passion, the humanity with which he has brought into that effort was very touching. It's good to have the UN as a cover to save Malloch-Brown so that others who are helping feel that, well, it's not the US taking charge of everything. But the US played the primary role, and it should continue to play the primary role, and God bless you for that. And I really say this change of presentation, this humility which Mike expressed today, is very much emblematic of the Obama administration and the new style of leadership he has brought into a world, which I think is absolutely necessary, Because in a web world with weakened hierarchies, you can't exercise leadership in the old way. It has to be more subtle, it needs more charm, it requires more softness, it requires telling others, yes, you're also involved, you're part of it. I think that's absolutely necessary for the new style of leadership that's needed today for global governance. And the G20 is part of it. And other processes are part of it, involving others, giving others credit, while those who are able to put in more effort. And we shouldn't lightly say, well, let the UN build up its own capabilities. It will take years for the UN to come to agreement. And one reason why the G20 has been called into historical service is because the UN is incapable of responding quickly to urgent needs. In the case of Myanmar, Cyclone Nargis like Haiti, a disaster of biblical proportions. And for 2-3 weeks, there was a standoff between international agencies. And a Myanmar government, there was paranoia. When French and American warships brought supplies, instead of sending their soldiers to facilitate the landing of those supplies, they put their soldiers into defensive positions, fearing an invasion. An entire airport was kept for the Air Force instead of being opened up for the rescue effort. So we decided in ASEAN that, look, they are part of the family. Yes, a strange member of the family, but we've got to rally around it. So we called a meeting. Singapore was in the chair at the time. And I remember the Indonesian foreign minister looking into the eyes of the Myanmar foreign minister and asking him, what do you mean to us? And what do we mean to you? And why do you reject all offers to help? He said, I've got to make a phone call back home. I said, take all the time you need. He came back at 3 o'clock and said, we agree. ASEAN will become a clutching mechanism between the Myanmar government and international agencies. We formed a tripartite working group. And despite initial complaints, eventually aid flowed through to the last corners of the Irrawaddy Delta. And they were spared a second wave of deaths from starvation or disease. So here, because we knew the idiosyncrasies, so we played a bridging role. But at the same time, we did not try to enlarge our role to say, look, we'll try to rebuild your society and solve your all internal problems, because we know that if we try to push in that direction, the paranoia will become extreme, and whatever help we offer will just be rejected and people will die. So I think in this new dispensation, there's got to be a respect for national differences. It's like we can't solve problems in the family. We can't solve problems in many institutions. How can we presume to solve problems in other people's countries? Yes, when those problems spill over, like in Somalia or Yemen or Afghanistan, then you say, oh, no, we've got to put a lid to them, but only to a point. And beyond the point, we say, look, these are your problems. We try to help you. If you want us to help you, we'll help you. But if you prefer us not to help you, well, good luck to you. And then that way, we shoulder less burden, we'll be less exhausted, and we'll make more and better progress.
Well, thanks, George. I mean, I think, this point that ASEAN and Singapore was the vital intermediary between the global and the suspicious national Myanmar is a key point, and it goes to this issue that, you need all three levels, and hence, Samir, I mean, the question to you about, making regional networks operational, I suspect they need the legitimacy of being linked to global superstructures, but let's hear your view.
Absolutely, they definitely do. Not to get into too much political hot water, but in our part of the world, most of the blocks are political, and what is required really are economic blocks that will wither away from the very micro decision-making process into the more regional. The more economic decision-making we do on the regional level, the more we can actually channel some of that into the political realm, where political decisions will follow the economic, and rather than the other way around. But that does need an international body to support that. It does need, obviously, without it has to be an independent international body without any agendas, and it has to be neutral, and it has to be doing it for the right reasons. But it has to happen, and the more we push internationally to the region, the more we support the region in terms of economic support, in terms of the feasibility of regional projects, the financing, the World Bank, the IFC. These are the things. I don't think there's a need to create more local blocks. What is needed is to support what is existing today and the economic decision-making by having international organizations support the creation of a closer network. Obviously, that will not happen if those countries don't want it to happen. But I think that today countries are realizing more than ever that there is a real need for cooperation across borders. Hopefully when the Palestinian issue gets resolved, this will also be another added incentive. We've unfortunately, as a region, sat down and said, everything's going to freeze because there's war. No, things should not happen that way. We should cooperate, we should link the region, and when Israel decides to get out of its fortress mentality, it has a plug and play where automatically it can interconnect to the entire Arab world. But we have to do it by ourselves today. We're not going to be able to help, expect help from others if we don't help ourselves. So the idea is and I think going back to the issue of youth, there is a genuine need to create millions and millions of jobs, and this can only be created if we do it on a regional level. Jordan cannot create 100,000 jobs a year that are sustainable for the long term if we think about just the Jordanian economy. There's the rebuilding of Iraq, there's Syria coming into the region, the Gulf countries looking at projects other than real estate today. So there's a lot of projects that are extremely inviting, and the international bodies should be looking at supporting the region, doing the right thing as well.
Thank you. Thanks. Some more questions quickly from the floor? Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Mina Al-Arabi. I'm from H.R.H Al-Awsat newspaper, but I'm also a young global leader, and have had amazing leadership from Haakon. He's way too humble. I wanted to ask two questions. The first is about international institutional reform. We've heard it said so many times. Everybody agrees it's necessary. I mean, that's with all due respect. I mean, you guys did great presentations, but it's not new in terms of agreement that it's necessary, but what will it take? I mean, is it about changing the Security Council formation? Is it sidestepping the UN, really, since people seem to think that any sort of reform there will take too long? What is the solution? My second question is really regarding leadership, and because we've done quite a bit of work on leadership with the young global leaders, in today's world, what does it really take to take a leader, like, for example, President Obama, that captured so many people's imaginations, but what does it take to take a leader to get people to become individual innovators and really have the leap of faith to make a difference and not be cynics, which I think most of us usually are? Thank you.
Great questions. Hold them, panel, because I'm going to make you answer, all of you answer that one at the back.
Doug Horswell with Tech. One of the great accomplishments of the last century was the expansion of world trade as a result of institutions, including an international framework of law and practice. Now we have the Doha round stagnating. Is that an indication that the apparatus, and particularly the institutions around trade, are in fact failing us and have to be revised?
Any other last ones before? Yes, over here. Jamie.
Thank you. Last September,
Can you introduce yourself, just
Jamie Drummond, Executive Director of One, a global advocacy organization. Last September, President Obama put forward an inspiring vision for a new plan for the Millennium Development Goals, a new plan for some old ideas we've all been working on. We've heard 3 leaders in the last 36 hours say, reassert their support for the Millennium Goals, and many more probably in the next few days say so. The G20, the G8, and Sarkozy yesterday, the host of the G20 and Sarkozy. So that the support at a state level in many ways is still there, as most epitomized by President Obama's words. But the element of a new plan will be those non-state actors being brought behind a new strategy in a new and exciting ways. And you've got young global leaders, you've got corporate leaders, and you've got the state actors. We desperately need that new strategy for the Millennium Goals, and I'd encourage that one of the ways all these players could work together and partners could work together could be in reviving and revitalizing the campaign for the Millennium Goals, to which everyone asserts support, but everyone knows we're not going to achieve the Millennium Goals as we stand right now, especially in Africa, by 2015, and in this year and in 2010 and at this Davos. It would be a great thing to galvanize all these new partners, but still recognizing the key leadership role of the state. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so we're going to start at the end, and in a sense, these were very similar questions, which is, and let me phrase it less politely than our 2 questioners did, which is, come off it, guys. You can go on protesting and saying, wouldn't it be a great thing to have stronger international organizations? How are we going to get it done? When are we going to get it done? Haakon.
Okay, if I start with the Millennium Development Goals first. First of all, the young global leaders have an initiative on the Millennium Development Goals led by John MacArthur, and they're advising on how to revitalize the MDGs and maybe even redesign them. But also, they are looking to get commitments from individuals instead of states, nation states, so that every one of us can actually make a commitment to one of the goals and what we want to do concretely in the years to come. And they're going to collect many of those, and if that can be more of a sort of bottoms-up movement of the Millennium Development Goals. Now, I think the Millennium Development Goals are fantastic, but they are not ambitious enough. They are ambitious, but then again, they're not ambitious enough, because, for instance, we're going to halve extreme poverty. That's not really. I mean, we need to end extreme poverty. If we accept that there were, 1 billion people in extreme poverty in 1990, then there should be 500 million in 2015. That's obviously not good enough. We need to move beyond that. But then again, we have made tremendous progress on many of the MDGs. We have, for instance, malaria. That's actually now getting very good results, where we will shoot the target on malaria. So and even on poverty, we've made tremendous steps forward. So I think it's also important to count our victories and not only look at the negative side of what's been going on, because we have made tremendous achievements, and the millions of people that have been working every day very hard to lift other people, we have to recognize that what they have been doing has been actually successful. And that's really important, I think, because that's something that inspires us. So we need both. We need constructive criticism, but we also need to acknowledge that a lot of the things that have been done have actually been very effective and successful. Our moderator has also done a lot through the UNDP, for instance, on the Millennium Development Goals.
Thanks, Haakon. Just because now I have time, I'm going to say that, in a sense, you could summarize, Haakon, what you said is, individual effort, initiative, group initiatives are, a huge extra way that we can improve the system and move towards these goals. Now, I'm going to ask each of you, in a sense, to just, in the couple of minutes we've got left, distill it to something similar. What's your wish list of one to move forward international cooperation in an effective way? Indra.
Mark, I tell you, my observation is that the young people today, the millennials, are willing to cooperate, willing to rewrite the rules. As you get older, people get more rigid in their thinking and stand in the way of cooperation and progress. So the question is, how do we get more young people into decision-making and allow them to reshape the world order? Because I think if we leave it to us old people, and I include myself, we'll be stuck in the old ways, because that's all we know.
Samir.
I want to agree. I mean, it's all about youth. It's all about how we as states prepare the youth to think out of the box, teach them how to think, not what to think, and have them take charge of the future. Communication has shown that it's cross-boundary. What happened in Haiti is very clear that youth do not wait for governments anymore, and I think more of that is required.
Thank you. Mike.
Hard to come up with one phrase, after this, but I would just say I think we need to be creative about how we solve global problems. I don't think it happens at a Bretton Woods II convention. I think it happens because we experiment with fora, we change people's mindsets about how to cooperate, and we bridge differences in how different sectors, the private sector, states, non-state actors, approach problems. To Jamie's point, we need to do a lot more, states need to do a lot more to figure out how to leverage the private sector, foundations, and non-state actors to achieve these global goals.
George.
When we blame ourselves, when we blame others, we'll never improve. And leaders who are always finding reasons to be angry with others can never lead. Don't blame another country, don't blame international institutions, don't blame a lack of aid. But because in the end, what matters the most is yourself. And I'm inspired by Kagame's repeated speeches that, look, what Africa needs is not aid. Yes, aid is good. What Africa needs is capacity building. But in the end, the main efforts must be made by the people themselves. So whatever the international institutions, those who are strong will find a way to survive. Even if Doha makes no progress, those who are creative will be able to make a living. It will be a messy world. The important thing is to build a better world from the bottom up. It's not possible to build a better world from the top down. In the end, it goes back down to education, to human resources, to the right values, to establishing trust, decency, respect for one another.
Well, look, I think we've heard an extraordinary range of things. The words that come through to me are pragmatism, creativity, opportunism, in the sense that pragmatism, don't wait for some perfect, fine design which is going to refix the world in one big go. No Bretton Woods moment here, no San Francisco, but taking the opportunities of crises and of where there's the political will to steadily improve these institutions. Second, the creativity, that the old ways of sitting back and thinking it's all about rewriting formal structures won't get you there. Whether it is youth and youth as an example to the rest of us, to just pile in and take the opportunity that's there and try to make these things work better, I think is key. And, beyond that, less explicitly said but implied at different points, the fact that these institutions are going through a change of ownership. The world of 2010 is a different one, with the rise of Asia, but the rise of many other parts of the world too. Emerging markets coming into this, a huge expansion of the number of independent nation states in the world, 192 members of the UN versus 48 at the beginning, and a huge expansion of the non-state actors. And rather than waiting with a centrally planned answer, what I think our panel was telling us this afternoon is allow those creative forces and frictions between them to play out, to find solutions. What we mustn't compromise on is our level of ambition. We need this stronger system of global cooperation, but it's going to come through the collective efforts of many of us working in many fields, rather than through some perfect design written by statesmen around a small conference room table. That world's gone. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, long time.